In the late 1600s, the European powers were struggling for control of the continent. These conflicts were mirrored in North America, where they fought for land and trade routes.
There's a sort of constant, intermittent warfare between France and England. And the colonies get drawn into that, and they don't like it because they consider it these quarrels are not their quarrels.
In 1689, the War of the League of Augsburg broke out in Europe. England, Spain, and others fought against France. In North America, it was called King William's War.
The wars in Europe have names like the War of the Spanish Succession, or the War of the League of Augsburg, or the War of the Austrian Succession. But the colonists call them Queen Anne's War, King William's War. As far as they're concerned, the monarch is forcing them into these positions, which they don't like.
These conflicts escalated when Native Americans became involved.
There were also very, very powerful and growing Indian polities in the Ohio Valley and in the Southeast and in the Great Lakes region. And so you have the Iroquois League and their allies up in the Great Lakes region, and groups in the Ohio Valley in the South, polities like the Cherokees and the Creeks, who are becoming now tremendously more powerful.
As King William's War ended in 1697, Queen Anne's War broke out only a few years later, in 1702, with many of the same countries battling over the same territories in the American frontier. In 1713, England, Spain, and France signed the Treaty of Utrecht. England took possession of Acadia, Newfoundland, and the valuable Hudson Bay region. France gained control of the continent's vast Indian-occupied interior. Spain maintained its holdings in Florida and in Central and South America. With the Treaty of Utrecht, the violence in Europe and North America was finally quelled, but only for a few decades. The War of Jenkins' Ear was a skirmish over smuggling and piracy in the West Indies. It would spark the much greater conflict called King George's War. It started in 1731, when the Spanish Coast Guard stopped the boat of British merchant Robert Jenkins in the West Indies. The Spanish officers claimed he was trespassing through their waters and proceeded to search his ship. A vicious fight broke out. One of the Spanish agents sliced off Jenkins' ear and told him to present it to the English king. When Jenkins displayed his severed ear to the House of Commons, public opinion turned against Spain. 8 years later, in 1739, England declared war against Spain. By 1742, the War of Jenkins' Ear escalated into the War of the Austrian Succession. It spread to America, where the European powers of England, France, and Spain fought over territories and trade routes. Since they saw the conflict as a war among European monarchs, the colonists referred to it as King George's War. France and Spain fought England. Battles raged from Georgia's plantations to the trading posts of Canada and into the French-owned Louisiana Territory. Thousands of British colonists also fought for England. After a ragtag colonial army led by William Pepperell of Massachusetts managed to capture the French fortress of Louisbourg in Nova Scotia, England won the war. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle was signed by England, France, and Spain. The Massachusetts colonists were outraged when England returned the hard-won fortress of Louisbourg to France.
Often at the peace treaties, what happens is that colonies will simply be swapped, which of course makes it even more dangerous from the point of view of the colonists, because the idea that their interests come last, that if it makes sense for the Crown to simply hand over something, the Crown will do that.
Although the British had won King George's War, their concession of Louisbourg ensured that the French would remain powerful in North America for another 2 decades. In the late 1750s, many groups laid claim to the fertile Ohio River Valley.
The main thing about the Ohio Valley is that it's very, very good farmland.
The French wanted to connect their territory of Louisiana to their territory of Canada through the Ohio River Valley. But individual colonies in the East also had a stake in this rich area.
In places like Virginia and in New England, there were people who had invested heavily in speculating on this land that they did not yet own, but which they thought they would eventually own.
In 1754, Virginia's Governor Robert Dinwiddie sent a militia, led by 21-year-old George Washington, to claim a portion of Ohio for Virginia. About 40 miles from Fort Duquesne, a powerful fort on the mouth of the Ohio River, Washington and his men surprised a detachment of French troops and killed their leader. This act sparked the first real World War. For 7 years, across 7 seas, France, Spain, Austria, and Russia fought England and Prussia.
In America, we called it the French and Indian War, but in Europe, they called it the 7 Years' War. That's how long it lasted. The British and the French were the two superpowers, and they fought in India, in Europe, in the West Indies, and in America.
The Ohio River Valley was the staging ground for the battle between the French and British. After Washington's attack on the French in the Ohio Valley, British officials feared reprisals from angry French colonists living on British lands. So they preemptively drove French residents from their colony in Acadia, now known as Nova Scotia, to Louisiana, where their descendants are known as Cajuns. In the Ohio River Valley, the French relied heavily on their Native American allies to fight the British. That's why it's called the French and Indian War.
More than half of the Indians had supported the French, and they weren't too friendly to the British, and the British did not know how to handle the Indians.
In 1756, French and Indian troops defeated British General Edward Braddock when he attempted to take Fort Duquesne. But the war turned when English Secretary of State William Pitt took personal command of the Army and Navy. British troops soon captured Fort Louisbourg in Nova Scotia, a critical French stronghold. Other forts throughout the American frontier began to fall into the hands of the British, including Forts Duquesne, Ticonderoga, Crown Point, and Niagara. But final victory didn't come until 1759, when the British Army, led by Major General James Wolfe, attacked Quebec. During the fight, General Wolfe was mortally wounded, but upon hearing of the British victory, he sighed, "Now, God be praised, I will die in peace." After the French defeat, the 1763 Treaty of Paris drew the new lines of control in North America. The British raised their flag over Florida and Canada. France had to give New Orleans and parts of Louisiana to Spain to pay for its support during the war. But the Treaty of Paris had a major impact on the Indians. They could no longer count on France as an ally in a possible war against Britain or the American colonists.